Lord Hayward, Nigel Farage is quite excited this morning after the revelation that Reform have overtaken the Conservatives in the polls. What do you make of that? Is it real?
It's not the polls, it's in one poll.
The
If one
YouGov poll.
looks at, sorry?
The YouGov poll yesterday.
Yes. And if you look at the polls, there have been a proliferation of them. On Tuesday, there were three polls published in one afternoon. In one of them, a YouGov poll, the Conservatives led then, Reform by 1%. In another poll, the Tories led Reform by 9%. And in a third poll, the Conservatives led Reform by 15%. So if you look at the general position, there's no question, Reform are improving their position. But it is not the case that Reform have actually overtaken the Conservatives in the polls.
Well, they're doing pretty well considering the party's only 2 or 3 years old. And obviously they've now got the extra impetus of Nigel Farage declaring himself leader. So there is momentum. I guess the question is, I wonder where this actually goes. I mean, they're not going to run out of steam anytime soon, I don't think, are they?
That's a fair comment. It's a fair observation. There's no question about it. Nigel Farage has provided a degree of interest to the election in general, not just to Reform, because he's a great public speaker and has a great personality, and as just being discussed, he communicates well with individuals. But having said that, although it's a new party, it's picked up, all the polling research shows that it's picked up the voters that previously voted for UKIP or for Brexit or whatever. Yeah. So it's misleading to describe it as a new party. It's a follow-on party.
Yeah, I guess. It does seem, though, that Farage does rather reach the parts that other politicians can't reach, though, in terms of his charisma. I mean, he's quite the weapon in that respect, certainly versus, I think, what was labelled as the timidity, if you like, of Angela Rayner last night, and the lacklustre performance so far of Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer, in my opinion. They're both pretty wooden and unremarkable, I think.
I think it's fair to say that the election campaign has not electrified the populace. Your conversation about the Euros just now is the event that's much more likely to have an electric response from the public at large, both in England and in Scotland, than the general election. And it's sad, as a Democrat, I wish that more people were more interested in the election and that they felt interested in what was being said by the different politicians.
Yeah, no, indeed. Well, and we'll see how turnout is affected by the behaviour of those politicians over the next 2 or 3 weeks. As a polling expert, what do you think the Reform performance, the success in, albeit a poll, and I guess if there were a poll of polls, I'm not quite sure where they would sit. To your point, that would be quite an interesting thing to look at, wouldn't it, in terms of an overlay, an average, a poll of polls. But how does that then necessarily translate or not translate into votes? And of course, the big question is parliamentary seats. I mean, there's a huge difference between receiving 5 or 6 million votes even and actually even getting a single parliamentary seat, isn't there?
There is a big difference. If I can go back to your first question, in fact, the polls of polls, and of course you can average them in many different ways, still show the Conservatives clearly ahead, but that the margin is narrowing because Reform are improving their position. There's no question about that. What is interesting is that actually week on week, there are council by-elections going on. And I wrote about this a few weeks ago. And there was one just down the road from where you're broadcasting from, and in Mottingham New Eltham yesterday, a council by-election in which actually almost 3,000 people voted, which is more than any opinion poll. And the Conservatives improved their position against the last local elections and actually outvoted Reform 6-1.
Wow.
And the Reform Party put an effort in. So there is a conflict between people who are casting their votes week on, week off in different parts of the country at the moment. Going to your other question, which is the question of seats, it will be difficult for Reform to get more than the odd 1 or 2 seats in different places. Interestingly enough, as well as much attention being paid on places like Clacton, one of the parts of the country where Reform might do very well is actually in South Yorkshire and in the northeast, where historically UKIP and Brexit have done very well. But for a relatively similar amount of percentage votes, the Lib Dems are more likely to get many more seats than Reform.
Yeah, I see. And do you think the fact that Reform are seeing such an improvement in the polls, they're resonating for sure, do you think that as a consequence of that, we're now going to start seeing in rhetoric and policy terms, both from the Conservatives and Labour, a kind of shift in the narrative towards the right? I mean, it was very interesting, I think, that looking at the debates last night, which I'm sure you saw, Angela Rayner was almost criticised by the Greens, the Lib Dems, and certainly by Stephen Flynn from the SNP, almost for being I mean, he didn't use these words, these are my words, but a plastic Tory. The fact that they want to keep the two-child benefit cap, the fact that they're all about wealth and growth, it seems, and not increasing taxes. Do you think that that's a sign, and there will be further signs in the coming days and weeks, that the main parties are going to have to shift rightwards to counter the surge of reform?
I don't think it's a question of shifting to the right or whatever. One has to remember that Reform actually, or UKIP and Brexit, when Nigel Farage last stood at a constituency, it was in Thanet South, and actually he took more votes, both in percentage terms and number terms, from the Lib Dems than he did from the Conservatives. So he pulls votes from all sorts of different places. But what we have is a position whereby the electorate at large are not committed to any one party. It's almost voters without a cause. We're seeing this in the fluidity of the different polls, where they're going up and down at an incredible rate.
Do you think there's still lots of sorry to interrupt? Do you think there's still lots of undecided voters?
Precisely. Masses of undecided voters. The largest single block are Conservatives from 2019, but there are lots of others who are either undecided or what I describe as loosely decided. They could break that link fairly rapidly. And what you're going to see is messaging from all the political parties aimed at A, the undecideds, and B, the loosely attached, to try and get people to support them. I think the real interest on election night will be that there will be some pretty freakish results in some parts of the country or another.
And as a Conservative peer, I have to ask you this. I mean, given that the Conservative Party might only return 60 or 70 MPs, I mean, some polls are saying 30 or 40, but I take your point that obviously you can't take an individual poll on isolation. But let's say the Conservatives will barely get 100 MPs returned to Parliament, possibly. The question has to be, where has it all gone so horribly wrong for the Conservatives, Lord Hayward?
Well, can I just say that I said, starting off my comments earlier on about figures being published on one day. Last week, one poll suggested that the Conservatives were going to get 60 seats, and a day later another one said 140 seats.
Should we split the difference at 100?
Well, okay, but the point I'm making is actually that the opinion polls appear, against the week-by-week votes, to be exaggerating the Labour lead anyway. And I'm the person who originally gave rise to the term shy Tories because of the analysis I did in 1991 in the run-up to the 92 election, looking at the opinion polls and saying they are overestimating.
Not much point in polls, is there? But where's it all gone horribly wrong? I'll ask again.
Oh, sorry, I was just coming on. Sorry, I'm answering too long. But there's no question that the Tory party campaign has been extremely disappointing. If I look back in my time, Tory party election campaigns have been pretty awful, not just this one.
But it's not just the campaign, is it? It's the run-up. It's the last 3 or 4 years of the Conservative government. The haplessness, the mistakes, the errors, the failed promises, the U-turns, the disengagement as far as the electorate are concerned. I mean, it's all of those things. It's not just Rishi Sunak appearing in a wetsuit with the word exit above his head the next day at the Titanic exhibition the next day. It's not just the campaign. It is what Conservative voters believe is basically an unconservative government.
There's no question that the electorate, if there's one thing that comes up most often on the doorstep, and I like canvassing, I like meeting people, it's as they put it, the chaos of 2020 to 2022. And the electorate started off with that frame of mind.
Yeah.
That, you know, kind of, are you proud of what's come up in 2020 to 2022? And that is where the whole campaign starts from, in a difficult position.
There is an argument, and Lord Robert Hayward, thank you very much indeed for your contribution. There is an argument, of course, that no party would have done any better during the COVID years, or indeed managing the recovery, inflation, interest rates and so on. There is that argument.